All right, so we're going to be working in lesson 9.3, and we're going to be solving quadratics by taking the square root, okay? So we've already talked about how you could factor this. We've talked about how you could do the quadratic formula on this, okay? So what we're going to look at today is just a third way to solve it, and that is how we take the square root of each side. So looking at our first example here, okay? All right, so what we're looking at here on this guy is we want to get rid of this squared, okay? And the way to get rid of the square is the square root. So just like addition and subtraction are opposites of each other when we're solving an equation, and then if I think about multiplication, division will undo the multiplication. Well, when you have something to the second power, square rooting will undo that, okay? So when I come over here and look at this, to get rid of this squared right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to square root both sides. So that square root and square will cancel out, and the only thing I have left over here is x equals, and then the square root of 81 is 9. Now, we do need to put a plus or minus out front, because remember, this guy right here tells us how many answers we should have, and he says that we need 2 answers. So we're going to put this plus or minus out front. So now just think about square root rules. It's just saying you have 2 of the same numbers multiplied together. So 9 times 9 will get me 81, and so will negative 9 times negative 9. That will get me 81 as well. So that's why we go ahead and put this plus or minus out front. We're just saying there are 2 answers, a positive and a negative 9. Okay? All right, so let's go to the next problem. So now this problem here, same type of thing. I'm going to take the square root of each side. So now when I do that though, these still cancel, m equals, and then I've got a problem. Our problem is we cannot take the square root of a negative number. So just like when we were doing the quadratic formula, when you get a negative inside the square root, it's going to be a no solution. Now just keep in mind when we're talking about a no solution, we're just saying, look, if I draw a picture of an arc, it is not going to touch that x-axis, okay? All right. Okay, once you take a second here and try to come up with an answer for C. All right, so on C, you should have square rooted each side. So n equals, and then if you had to type in your calculator, the square root of 144 is 12. So you get plus or minus 12. All right, so now on D, it's a little different now because now we have something else on the same side as the variable. We have the 16 that we need to get rid of, okay? So there are kind of 2 steps here. So your first step, I'm going to zoom in over here. Our first step is going to be to isolate. Okay, we're going to isolate the variable. And then once we have isolated the variable, we're then going to take the square root of each side. Okay, so those are our 2 steps. Isolate, then take the square root of each side. All right, so if we come back over here, so when I'm saying isolate, what I want you to kind of think of here is let's just take this 2 out. The 2 is not there at all. Just don't even pay attention to it, okay? How would you solve this equation? And hopefully most of you would say, well, you're just going to divide by 16, and you're going to get that g by itself, and that would be correct, all right? So you would have technically g equals 25 over 16. I'm not going to worry about putting that in my calculator. I'm just going to leave it as 25/16. So now our next step then would be, okay, now let's get rid of that squared. So if I come back here and kind of erase that a little bit, I guess it didn't erase very well, and put that squared back in, all right, I'm now going to square root each side. Now, square root of a fraction, we've talked about it. It's not scary. You're just going to take the square root of the top number and get a 5, and the square root of the bottom number and get a 4, and you have plus or minus 5/4. Okay, all right, let's look at the next one. So again, first step, we're going to isolate. All right, so we want to get this guy all by itself. So to isolate, we're going to go ahead and add the 36 over. Okay, so we have m squared equals 36. So we've isolated, and now we're going to get rid of that square root. So we're going to, get rid of that exponent of 2. So we're going to square root both sides, so those cancel. So m equals plus or minus 6. Okay. All right, I want you to take a second and I want you to try to do F on your own. All right, you should have completed F. We're going to have you add the 46 over to the other side. So you get x squared equals 46. And then you're going to need to take the square root of each side. And so when you do that, let me put it in my calculator real quick. You get x equals plus or minus 6.8. Okay, now we are still going to go ahead and be rounding to the nearest tenth. Watch your rounding rules. If you put a 7 here, that means you weren't paying attention to the 8, all right, after the 7. So really look at that. Make sure you're following your rounding rules. All right, so now on this guy, we got a couple of steps we need to do. So again, if you want to ignore that squared at first, that's fine. And then just think about how would we solve this equation? Well, hopefully you're telling me we would be subtracting the 15 off both sides first. So we'd get 3x squared equals negative 15. And then when we're solving the equation, we would divide by 3. So we would get x squared equals negative 5. And so now I've isolated that variable. And now I'm going to square root both sides. Okay? And again, square rooting both sides, if you're square rooting a negative, you'd be getting no solution. There's no answers. Okay? All right, I want you to go ahead and try to do h on your own. Okay, so you should have tried to do subtract 16 from both sides. So you're going to get 4d squared equals 0. And then you're going to divide by 4. So d squared will equal 0. So I've isolated my square, and now I'm going to square root both sides. So now when I square root a 0, it's just going to be 0. Putting a plus or minus out front, it doesn't really hold true to the 0 because 0 can't hold a positive or negative. It's a neutral number. So just 0 be your answer. All right, and the last thing we're going to look at, model each problem with a quadratic equation. Remember, quadratic just means it has an exponent of 2 in it. So we're writing an equation with a squared in it somewhere. Solve and round to the nearest tenth if necessary. All right, so find the length of a side of a square with an area of 225 meters. All right, so if we think about a square, hopefully you guys would agree that the sides are the same. So if I call it like x, then another guy would have to be x, right? And if I'm looking for the area, well, area means length times width. So I would be taking x times x, or we call that x squared, right? Add up your exponents side by side, add those exponents. And that's going to equal 225. So now square root both sides. And so when you square root 225, you end up with 15. So x equals 15 meters. All right. So if I think about that, if I come back over here, I would be putting 15 in here and 15 in here. So you have a 15 by 15 square. All right. And on the next one here, it says find the radius of a circle. Okay. So now we got to think about circle, and you've got to know this formula. What's formula for area of a circle? So area would be pi r squared. Okay. And so if I'm looking here, it tells us that the area is 121. So 121 equals. Now for pi, because they told us we're going to be doing rounding, we're going to go ahead and put in 3.14. Remember, if they say exact, we want an exact answer, we leave pi in it. But since they're asking us to round it off, we're going to go ahead and round it off and use our 3.14 r squared. Okay, so again, you're going to isolate first, right? So you're going to take 121 and you're going to divide it by 3.14. All right, and when we do that, again, round to the nearest tenth, so you're going to get 38.5 equals r squared. And then in your calculator, take the square root, and so your radius would be 6.2 yards when rounded off correctly. All right, that concludes notes for 9-6.